It's time for my virtual Jericho with John Mair.
Hello, welcome to the new year and welcome to a new series of My Jericho. Let's start with a star, shall we? An academic star. Danny Dorling, the professor of geography at the university. His last My Jerichos have attracted record audiences, 1,000 each. This time I'm sure will be no exception. Meanwhile, let's pass over to Danny and his powerful lecture on inequality given in the church last week.
7 children. Give me 7 children until they're age 7, and I'll try and give you the future men and women in the UK. It's an enticing title. I'm obviously not going to manage to tell you what the future is, but I'll let you know what my thoughts are over the next 45 minutes, and then we'll have a chat and ask questions. I'm going to show you a few slides about various things. You don't have to be able to see the slides. They're a prop for me. Just to reassure myself, I'm not making this all up. There is very often data behind what I'm saying. The first thing I need to tell you about are geographers, because I'm a geographer, and there is a connection between geography and the future of the UK and inequality. That graph up there is from the Financial Times last year. It was produced at the time of COP26, whichever COP we're on, to show the connection between climate change and inequality. And if you've got very good eyesight, you can see the third line down shows you the UK. The best of 10th of people in the UK each produce pollution that's equal to the worst of half of the population of the UK. So there's a connection between inequality and climate change. And of course, climate change is all about the future. The only reason we're worried about how much CO2 people are emitting is because of what we know it's going to do. And part of the future for 7 children will be what kind of temperature will they be living with. And I thought, well, if my colleagues on the physical geography side are allowed to speculate about the future and how much we're going to all heat up, I should be allowed to as well. What's interesting about this kind of data, that's the FT data from last year. This little graph is actually exactly the same data that I produced in a book called The Equality Effect. So the data doesn't change very much when it comes to pollution and climate change. It only changes quite slowly. My graph isn't as good as the FT's graph, but it's a kind of, these are standard pictures that you'll see of how much the top have, how little everybody else has. This coming Monday, in a few days' time, Oxfam will produce its annual Davos report of, it only takes 6 billionaires own half the planet, that kind of thing. And we become we become used to this. We're so used to it. There's no shock effect. And so the people who are producing the Oxfam report every year have to try and find another way of shocking you about how bad things are and how bad things got. Geography on the subject, and I've got a map here, of course. We've all got our own individual biases and stories of where we come from, and they affect what we believe to be truth. And you've heard part of mine. 2 parents meet in Oxford. My mum and dad were university graduates. You can immediately pigeonhole me. Move up to Cowley to go upmarket from this slum. Those of you who know the history of Jericho will know that this was the place you did not want to be in 1968. So I was brought up there. My dad became GP for Temple Cowley and Blackbird Leeds. And already, apart from the fact you've already made assumptions just by looking at what I look like, you've got me pigeonholed about why I am and what I believe. But entire academic subjects can also have these kind of positionalities. And this is a generalization. But I thought I'd show you some facts about geography. That map is a map of who's most likely to go to university in the northwest of England. These things are called polar areas. You don't have to, they just divide the country up by the areas where you're least likely to go, which are the red areas. Roughly 1 in 10 or fewer children go to university from those red areas in the city Liverpool, in the city Manchester. Most likely to go to dark grey areas, over 50% go by 18, 60% by about 22, 23 have gone. Very, very divided. You can predict a lot about the future of children just knowing their postcode. You can do this more the more unequal a country gets. So in the United States, if you know the zip code of a child, you can say which children are more likely to end up going to prison than to university. Of course, nobody tells mums who've just given birth to a child, actually, given where you've given birth, that's what's most likely to happen. We're all very optimistic about our children. When you ask parents what's going to happen to their children, they tend to be very optimistic about their economic futures and so on. That begins to reduce at age 15, 16, 17, kind of becomes more realistic. And I think in the middle class, it reduces when the children are in their 20s. But anyway, let me show you another of these pictures. Here's Oxford and around Oxford, which may interest you more. So the dark red areas, the areas where you're least likely to go to university, is the most recent data, I think. Littlemore, Blackbird Leys, Barton, if you know your Oxford, you're in the Ring Road, and you've got the night lights. Part of Kidlington, part of Whitney, part of Abingdon, part of Didcot. Wrong side of the tracks, kind of one way. Not that going to university is the be all and end all, by the way, I should say. Okay? In fact, in many ways, during the pandemic, you're much better off not going to university as a young person and doing a job which was needed. But there's time for questions if you want to talk about that later. And then you see the sway, the dark grey areas where you're odds on to go. At the extreme of this, by the way, there's a particular street in London where you're odds on to go to Oxford and Cambridge, which may have been the one the minivans were on, but anyway. But we have all these geographical inequalities. And here's London. And what's interesting about London is you'll see there are very few areas like those areas in Oxford. The whole of London, young people are more likely to go to university. You've got to go way out now to the outside, to the east, to find low rates. And London kind of splits west, middle, that then is split in between, massively odds on, and the next quintile. So lots and lots of maps. But part of the reason I've been showing you those maps about polar areas and most likely to go to university is we have enormous numbers of statistics now, almost too much in terms of numbers. We can look at who does what degree in Britain. There are 86 university degrees which at least 500 pupils take. This data is from 2019, I think. And of the 86, these are the degrees which are the most balanced, where young people are most likely to do these regardless of where they grow up. And they're from the social work, the biggest one is nursing with 6,700 students a year. If you like, these are the least posh, the most mixed degrees at university, out of 86. I'm going to jump forward, because I've got to get onto my 7 children, to the top of that table. Now, somebody's got to be top. But you'll see that human geography, what I teach, is of all 86 degrees in the whole of the UK, the poshest. It's marginal. We have 12 students from the more affluent areas, the areas you're most likely to go to university from, but every one from poorer areas. This is all geography degrees in the whole of the UK. After that, it's dentistry, 11 to 1. Right? People reading classics. The say reading because so much classics and put in England, sorry, in Oxford and Cambridge, when we say read. Economics, geography, physical and human combined, languages, which often state schools don't teach languages, often now do, and med, on 1,285 medics, 7 to 1. So I come from a posh discipline. And in a way, you've got to be a bit confident to do something like economics or geography because it doesn't naturally lead to a job. But if you're not worrying about whether you're going to get a job, because everybody knows always gets a job, you may be more likely to do that kind of degree. But there's other things going on as well. I used to live in Sheffield. And when I lived in Sheffield, in 3/4 of the city, there was no geography A-level being taught. Only in the posh quarter of the city, the 6 posh state schools, was geography taught. Last thing about geography, but just to try and give you an idea about why I think inequality should matter for geographers. My colleagues, by the way, often get upset about me talking about this. Nobody likes to be stereotyped with big posh, but But what will happen is geography will slightly diversify, and then we won't have the top slot anymore, and we'll celebrate how great it is. This came out in November from the Sutton Trust. The proportion of children doing each degree who had free school meals when they were at school, and they're very high. 6 children would have free school meals. Pharmacology, computing, social care, law, business have the highest percentages, but they only ever get up 10%. And then at the bottom, you've got veterinary science, the poshest. But if you're very nerdy about it, the dark blue line is more recent, mid-2010. And those geographers have just managed to tip the top place and take the least children with free school meals. So that's where we're from. That same Southern Trust report has incredible diagrams. I'll just tell you what this shows because it's hard to see it. But the 3 columns are, the first is, do you go to a private school or did you have free school meals? So we've missed about 80% of society. It's a Southern Trust did that. Then is, if you go to university, what kind of university do you go to? Russell Group, old, former Polytechnic. And then, how much money do you get in a job? And so you can see children from private schools flowing to the Russell Group, flowing to the highest paid jobs. But some not, and a few jumping down there, although they may have married somebody with a very high income, I suspect. And you can see the free school meal children fanning out, but only a tiny number going to the Russell Group universities, small number top jobs. So we kind of have these futures that we can map out. We have data that allows you to track children through time and see what happens. What we have less of is, of course, what happens when you get there and how people mix or don't mix, how we hide our backgrounds, how we don't talk about these things. More recently, what's been happening very recently with the pandemic. These are the average incomes of people in Britain, according to what was the British Household Panel study. This is the data comes out every year. You have a gap between men and women that we get very angry about, which is slowly narrowing and might take 40 years to narrow. And has narrowed with the pandemic. We have a gap between people who are black and minority ethnic and white, bigger, but actually also narrowed with the pandemic. Partly because you're more likely to actually keep your job during the pandemic if you're black, because your job's needed, rather than if you're white, more likely to be put on furlough, which meant dropping to 80% of your salary. And here's the gap between the quintiles. Now, of course, the quintiles are going to have the widest gap because they're defined by people's incomes. But it's enormous. Much bigger than these gaps between whether you're white or black or male or female. And this got wider, dramatically wider, at the start of the pandemic between February and March or May. And that's before the £20 universal credit a week was taken off. So if you want to know what's happened most recently in inequality, the country has just divided it even further, quite dramatically, suddenly, with that £20, if you know about it, a week, which is an enormous amount of money, £1,000 a year. Once you took that money away, which they've done, it's wider again. So the other gaps are generally narrowing between other kinds of inequalities. This is why I worry about money. What other things? We're an odd country. Again, if you had brilliant eyesight and you could read scrap, what you'd spot is that the very long bar is the UK. This is the European Union graph of inequality by countries, between areas, regions and countries. And in fact, inequalities between, this is the richer parts of London and the poor parts of the North East, are so wide in the UK that they had to break the scale. You couldn't actually get us onto the graph. But the fascinating thing about that graph is you can't spot where the second most unequal country is. Try and look for, which of those bars after the UK bar is the longest. There are lots and lots of countries with similar inequalities. So the UK is odd. The UK became odd. This is the league table of income inequality for Europe. And down with the red bar. Oh, So it's not just for Europe, it's for all the OECD countries. Countries which are more unequal than us, this is a different measure, it's between people, other places. United States, slightly more, Turkey, Bulgaria, which annoyingly keeps on. So I can't say we're the most unequal in Europe, I'd say, except for Bulgaria. Mexico, Chile, Costa Rica. And down the other end was scale, we've kind of got Czech Republic, Belgium, Denmark, Finland, Austria, Sweden, and so on. Which country, do you want to shout out, which country was more unequal than us in the early 1990s in Europe, geographically and socially? Germany, absolutely correct. If you wanted to know, as a geographer, I keep on being asked about levelling up. The government very amusingly decided to write levelling up papers after they declared they're going to level up. They decided to produce a white paper on actually what they meant, which has not worked out. Anyway, the people to ask about levelling up are Germans, because they did it. After reunification, to actually become more equal, you have to really, really want to do it, and it's not easy. Okay, let's try one more. Which country is the most level in the world by numerous measures? And it lowest civil mortality rate in the world, top for education, best country of business in the world, highest trust in the police, highest trust in the people, least organized crime, most stable, highest free. Somebody said Denmark. It's not Denmark, it's not Japan, they're both close. Finland, yes. Finland just beats. And those graphs are showing you the share of the top 1%. In the UK, we're heading to about the top 1% of people by income are taking a sixth of all income. Finland's down to what I think about 6%. What Finland has is what happened when I was a small boy up in Cowley. This country, the top 1% took 6% when I was young. We were Scandinavian here. Very different. And I can show you these kind of maps. These are Victorian maps of inequalities where we labelled areas vicious, semi-criminal, poor, through to yellow, which was the servant-keeping classes. And then we have modern deprivation maps. Part of the fact that fewer people have servants, there aren't so many differences nowadays, and we use nicer labels. So it's really interesting watching geographers trying desperately to work out what is the politically correct label I can do for this kind of area. And they kind of go through circles trying to do it without trying to insult anybody. What this is showing, I will get to the 7 children, I'm just trying to give you background on this, is the enormous rise in inequality that happened in the UK. You're probably aware, most of it happened in the 80s. So we go from the 70s and 60s, where we were one of the most equal countries. This is the Gini coefficient. We have this enormous rise year after year after year in the 80s. It reaches a plateau in the 90s. It then only ever deviates by 1% a year from that plateau. That's the error rate in the annual government survey. 1 year, if you're really good, and it deviates by 2%. Every 20 years, you expect that. So nothing happened. And this is all the Blair years, the Brown years, Cameron's time in office. Absolutely flat. And if you ever hear the Institute of Economic Affairs on this, they go, why are you talking about inequality? It hasn't risen at all. And you go, and I think of this graph as being like blood pressure. We used to have low blood pressure, then we had a huge increase in our blood pressure, and then we've been living with really, really high blood pressure for a long time. But there's a qualitative difference between being a child at the end of the 80s and being a child now. At the end of the 80s, your parents could remember things like full employment, which we had in the early 70s. Yeah, at the end of the 80s, you'd gone through mass unemployment, but there was still kind of, I don't want to sound too much like Brastoff and so on and all those films, but there was some sort of fight left. What happens with really high inequality year after year after year, decade after decade? is you begin to forget that anything else is possible. All you can do is try to get into that top 10%. The idea that it'll ever come together again, or what coming together might mean, it begins to go. It begins to disappear from your collective consciousness. Your parents grew up. They were children at a time of great inequality. There were always homeless people on the streets, as far as you know. And if your parents are young as well, you get the opposite in more equitable countries, where you get people shocked about injustices. A government minister in Finland makes the slightest mistake, they resign. They resign immediately. The number of resignations of Finnish ministers over the last few years, shocking. Whether actually anything wrong, but they'd like talk to the postal union without asking somebody else first or whatever. You know, well, I mean, the Prime Minister, she had her breakfast for free. Not a flashy breakfast, just breakfast. She's entitled to have a breakfast for free, but there's still an issue about why was she not paying for her own breakfast. Right? And today is a good day for this, really, is to think of differences. But in more equal countries, and in some ways we became like that in the 50s, 60s and 70s. Other people are like you. You expect them to behave decently in how you treat your friends and so on. You don't expect differences. Keep inequality really high for a long time, and you can begin to go back to that forelock tucking, oh, well, he might be a bit of a bounder, but he's a jolly chap, and, I trust him, and he's good for the finances, isn't he? And he's clever. Here's a few other countries: Canada, Germany, and Finland. And of course, Finland had an increase in inequality. It was just very small. In the past, it's not just Finland, Japan, Denmark, there are lots of more equal countries. Sorry, there's lots of graphs. We'll get to 7 children. I wanted to give you this kind of context side of it. Here's public spending as a percentage of GDP, going all the way from the 1960s through to 2026. Every government of the world tells the IMF how much money it's going to spend in future. So I'm amazed people don't look at this more. So that ranking up there, under my finger on it. That's 2008 in the banking crisis. Our public spending goes up. This is austerity going down. That's COVID. That spike. This is what's planned next. And they tell the IMF. So we are planning for big cuts to come. How does it compare with other countries? Here's the other 4 large countries of Europe: Spain, Germany, Italy, and France. And they're at the bottom. They all have a bounce up with a financial crash. They all have a huge jump up with COVID. But France is only planning to come down a little bit. We're planning to come down the most. That gap, about almost 15%. 15% is enormous. 100% would be a perfect communist society with no private ownership or money whatsoever. 0% would be anarchy, not even a light wash of the state. 15% difference is, it's still free national health services difference. It's quite a good one. You can put the rest of Europe on, and you can see we're still odd. I've missed out Ireland because its GDP figures make no sense. Because Amazon is sold beside the headquarter in Dublin. But you'll see we're still odd. We are odd, really odd. The only other 2 European countries which spent less, and this is on schools and hospitals and so on, than we did, were Greece and Spain in the past, shortly after or when they were governed by dictators or the colonels. And in a way, we still have the House of Lords, so on, but it's not quite the same as Franco, but it's odd. Almost at the 7 children now, for the context. What goes wrong when you get used to inequality? Well, you begin to get headlines. This one from The Economist last year, about when Britain's generation rent retires, where the subheading is "People who never buy houses will become an expensive problem." Right? And I complained to The Economist about this, and they did change the subtitle in the next story a few days later to something a little bit more sympathetic and understanding. You can imagine it for Oxford, the real problem is those people who are renting in Oxford, because they're going to cost them so much money in their old age when we have to pay their housing benefit. It's terrible. But us who've got a mortgage, we're the solution. Look how hard I'm working to make my little 2-bed worth 800,000 just over there. Right, remember, very high levels of income inequality. What happens? And that began in the late 90s. That top line is the proportion of 25 to 34-year-olds who are renting. And you see, inequality is high, renting increases and increases and increases. It's like the high blood pressure on effect. That dip is only because they've stopped leaving mum and dad's house and they're still there at age 34. It's not they've managed to get a mortgage, but you can see the other age groups are rising as well. This can't carry on forever, this kind of thing can't. Or you end up back to a 90% rented society at this kind of rate, with 10% being landlords. I'll skip that one. That's just about how many children have to share a bedroom with others and how many have spare bedrooms. And we're now getting to 7 children. Every year since the 90s, or actually before then, but done in the same way since the 90s, the government does a survey called Households Below Average Income. But it's actually of all households. We're at about 20,000, but you cut a bit, well, about 20,000 a year. And it produces our official statistics on poverty. But it isn't just about households below average income. The survey is of all the households of Britain. So it can tell us about everybody. And I'm going to show you the income statistics in a minute, so I'll describe them to you. But they also ask a series of questions. They ask 9 questions to adults and 12 to children. And these questions are things like, do you have enough money to keep your home in a decent state of decoration? And here you get the funniest differences in answers between people. And I asked people in Oxford about this. I used to live in Sheffield. And there's a very different attitude about what a decent state of decoration means depending on who you talk to. The person producing the question basically meant, can you afford a tin of paint? Not, can you get the bill visit? Some of them are more obvious. Can you regularly save £10 a month? Or do you have to spend all your money and get into debt? And I won't go through the kind of harrowingness of this. And can you have a holiday? Which I think is in a way, the most interesting one. So here's some of the results for can you have a holiday? A holiday, by the way, is a week away from your home, not staying with family or friends. If you want to know what a holiday is. And children from the poorest fifth of households, a majority of them would like but can't have a holiday. Children from the next fifth, 35%. Children from the best of fifth, just 2%. We're near to a majority of our children in Britain no longer have a holiday. So if you're a teacher, you do not ask people to write about what did you do on your holidays. And we're also beginning to see a rise in people saying they don't want, what's a holiday? Why would you want to do that? And of course, at the other end of the spectrum, there is an expectation to, well, we must get the kids vaccinated because how else are we going to get skiing in winter? And what are you going to do at Easter because you get bored by then? In summer, maybe one in Britain, one abroad. It's not too extravagant. In a country where the majority of children don't have a holiday. Those are the statistics for the country as a whole, which, depending on how I did it, you could talk about how terrible it is, or I could say, actually, it isn't that bad. And it'll depend on who I thought you were and who I was. I won't go through that. But the problem is the statistics are inhuman. Percentages and shares are inhuman. It doesn't work. Even for an audience interested enough to come out on a cold January evening and come to a church, it still doesn't work. They won't share. So I tried turning these into 7 children. And if you turn it into 7 children, 1 to 7, these are the kind of answers that you get, which produce you the same national result. So your poorest child, parent, probably a more parent, can't decorate. They can't afford to insure their house. That's home contents insurance, not building because they don't own the house. They can't save £10 a month. They can't always pay the bills. There's nowhere to play, and so on. Best of child can't have a holiday. You might be thinking, how come the best of child can't have a holiday? And I'll try to explain in a minute. But that's the kind of set of answers that have produced you 7 typical children. Why 7? 7 works for all kinds of reasons. There's 7-Up. How many of you don't know 7-Up? No, I can always assume you all know 7-Up. There's 28 up now. 7-Up, I've forgotten the exact date. I think it's 50s they were born. Selected in the 60s. We were so equal that they had to pick one set of kids from some of the poshest prep schools and another set, I think, almost from an orphanage. There were no children in between because it would be boring. Today, you can choose 7 typical children and you get the span because we're now so divided. The incomes per year, after tax, after benefit, after paying for housing. The poorest child's parents, probably just above £6,100 a year. Worked out for the child, that's £3.37 a day to feed, eat, clothes, buy toothpaste, bus tickets, holiday, everything else for that child. If you kind of think about, I don't know, what is it, how much we spend, £3 on feeding dogs who work for the police force. They were £3.37. And this is the middle child of the bottom 7, not the poorest child in Britain. Poorest child in Britain, you're talking food banks and we're talking malnutrition. Middle child, £3.37 a day per child. Family living on £6,100. Everything they need apart from that. The next child, Brandon, almost double that, £12,300 income a year, or £6.77 per day child. Can these, and those 2 in poorest sphere, can these £15,900 a year? So if you're trying to work this out for your household, but then you have 2 kids, or depend there's 2 of you, this is your combined incomes after tax, after paying for housing. David, my middle child, 19,300. On Twitter recently, I saw a set of academics complaining because the University of Cambridge had offered up a junior research fellowship, paying only £25,000 a year, where you can do what you'd like for 3 years. And the complaints were no academic job should ever be, right? If you do this kind of work, it really gets grating. This kind of thing. The middle child in Britain is living in a family with £19,000 a year to live off, or £10 to spend on that child a day. Food, clothes, everything. Emily, 24,800. Freddie, 32,900. Gemma, the middle child of the top 7, 51,200. And I've been playing games making up what these children are. Gemma's mum and dad run a corner shop. That's why they want 51,200. Middle child of the top 7. Remember, there's 14% in each 7th. The reason they can't go on holiday is that one of them always has to run a corner shop, I think. So we begin to move from statistics to fiction, if you like. Gemma goes to state school because 93% of children go to state school. Our best of child goes to state school. The parents could just about afford to send a private, but everything else would have to stop. And that happens in many cases when children go to private schools. At the bottom, there are more inequality in private schools than there are in state schools. And the posher the private school, the greater the inequality in the private school. Anyway, Gemma's parents, 51,000, £28 a day to spend on Gemma. There's a graph of it. These are parallel lines. These children will mix a little bit, but not much, and much, much less than their parents would have mixed or their grandparents would have mixed. for all kinds of reasons. Not least because the housing in where they live will have become more segregated. Can you afford to live there or not? But also the uncomfortableness of it. And I'm aware for time, so I won't go into this, but you've got a sort of sense of this, I think. And the reason I find this fascinating, perhaps it's my own inabilities or kind of lack of proper social control or behavior, but this kind of tricks at the things we don't talk about. At an Oxford University high table, you can talk about politics, and you can talk about sex if you're very avant-garde and bit. Right? The only thing you can't do is ever say where your children go to school in Oxford, because then you've given yourself away. And if the other people on the table don't send their child to the same school, there's something wrong with you. If you're sending your child to a state school, remember a third of children in Oxford go private. If you're sending your child to a state school and you're a well-paid academic, where you're sacrificing their future for your virtual secret. If you send your child to a private school, oh well, you're just trying to give them some advantage over everybody else, aren't they? And it's probably the grandparents keeping you some money. But it gets worse. If you send them to a particular school, and I'll stop here because I'm once I've been all
More than Oxford High, go on.
all right. That's the test. Well, it's in effect, we have secondary modern private schools in Oxford where you go to if you fail the entrance. I would never pass 11 plus. I couldn't read till I was 8. I'm incredibly lucky to have been born at the right time and could see Canal Street when there wasn't 11 plus. Incredibly lucky to have grown up in the city at the point where they just got rid of the secondary modern, that despicable school called Charwell that you went to if you failed 11 plus. And they just got rid of the county grammar, the little one, that you went to succeeded. And nobody knew what the good school was. So you went to the nearest one. Right? This is what happens in other countries. It no longer happens here necessarily. Or it happens here because you managed to get another £300,000 somehow put down on deposit mortgage to get into the catchment away from the school you're petrified going to, because of that map I showed you at the beginning of where you're most likely to go. Here's our 7 children. But what's preoccupying them? And you may look at that and think it's not, well, it's not in effect other European countries, but let's want to show you what happens above Gemma. And in a way, this is why Gemma's parents don't feel, well, they're running a corner shop. Why should they feel that well off? Even though they are. Above the top 7, the next single percentile of children, their family has 66,000 a year, if you like, spare. They've got to feed and clothe the kids with that, but 66,000 is quite a lot. The next percentile, 71, the next 87, the next 109, then 121, 175,000 income. So if you're in the 2%, you need 175,000. And the middle of the top 1%, which is an almost meaningless idea, but the middle of the top 1%, 621. I've worked out a way to explain the finance off my head. 175,000. That's around your Prime Minister's salary. Right, that's the middle of the 2%. That looks like a lot of money, but if you're used to having more than that, say you had quite a few children and other expenses, you might find it quite difficult to survive on 175,000 a year and be thinking, if they do shove me out of this job, at least my income's going to go up and I'll be able to live. And I'd left it like that. So 7 typical children, water, are dwarfed by those above them. And then everybody feels badly off. So I was joking partly about the Prime Minister, right, about the Prime Minister's salary. But it's fact, the same thing happens all the way down. So Gemma's mum and dad, I shouldn't go on about Gemma's, but it's interesting, the best of 7th child, they look around them and they see the doctor and the university lecturer and the person with the small business and the successful builder, and they're pissed off. They work really hard running a corner shop, and it's a struggle. £51,000 a year. I mean, it's only about 25,000 each, as far as they're concerned, their average. That's our starting point. How do we predict forward? And I've only got about 4 slides left. You'll be glad to know. And this is hard. I'm optimistic about this, not least because of the exceptionalism. You know, we are the second most illegal country in Europe after Bulgaria. Actually holding on to that position is quite difficult. It requires a lot of effort to fool the population into that. And we've been there before. The wide line is the income sharing aristocracy, the top 1% of the 1%. 1910, they were getting over 400 times the average income. This is Brideshead Revisited territory. I think it's Hartford College, Oxford, where Sebastian went. So fiction, so much more useful. Sebastian turns up with an allowance feeling more than £500 a year and brings his own servant with him, his own scout with him. This is this university. This is common about a century ago. Lady Marchmont, if you know your Brideshead Revisited, has an income declining, which is why they're in trouble from their investments in the colonies. That's where the money comes from. Has an income which allows her to run a stately home. That quite rather than dropping down is the aristocracy disappearing. It's the servants going. It's the equality coming. The other lines are the 1 in 1,000, 1%. And that rise is the kind of return of aristocracy, but in a different way. Has to find money elsewhere, not from an empire anymore, but certainly from banking while it worked, or other things while they worked. I'm going to end just a few slides with local, with a couple of low walls, and I should, for those who don't know, you should know, there were walls like this all over England, not just in Oxford, and there were little stubbly bits of them left in York and so on. Built in 1934, just going back, built after you've had 20 years of growing equality, of coming together. They were built 8-9 foot high with steel spikes so sharp that they would kill a child who tried to climb over them. A tank driver, I think during the war, Canadian, drove through one of the walls. There were 2, because he was so disgusted, because he'd grown up in a war-hit country, which was Canada. He was so disgusted that he drove through them. They rebuilt the wall. The wall was there to stop the children from the poorer side of the street walking past the richer houses on the way to school. This is the same Blackpool before that turned away on the red lines off. The best off 10th of the population, who used to take almost half of all income at the time of Sebastian. Go down and down and down. The walls were demolished in 1959, finally. Those 18 years were when I was a child in Oxford. My childhood was the most equal time the UK has ever been in a place which, you know, it's a place of inequality, but there's much different. And there's a rise on the top 10% occurring again. So we have that model of the past. But of course, what happened in the past was many things, and inequality fell around the world, not just in Britain. There's at the time the Russian Revolution, but more importantly, it was the First World War. First World War was only supposed to last a few weeks. Somebody had to pay for it, and it lasted for years. Agitation, trade union strikes, bench strikes, and then another war. And your great rulers have mugged it up twice and sent you to war twice. And we see equality rise in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, happened elsewhere in the world. And then we lost it in the 70s. And the rest of Europe didn't as much. But now we're back up at this peak again. It's really hard to hold it up there. You've got to convince people, don't worry, the future will be better. Trust in us. We'll make you all richer. We'll create economic growth. Your children will be better off. It's that which pays for the hospitals and schools, don't you know? And don't ask where my child goes to school. It's based on this idea of optimism. The future will be better. It works on our natural optimism for our children that we all have. When you have a baby, you look at it and you think it's going to have a good future, which is great. Right? Like I said at the beginning, it's when you get to 15, 16, 17, parents get a bit more realistic about their children. The politicians can use that hope and belief to tell you it's okay, trust in us. But when things get really divided, it gets harder for that to work. And I do think, the fact this pandemic's gone on and on is awful in some ways. But in another way, at what point do you stop believing them when they say, don't worry, next year's going to be better? This isn't as bad as a war. But if you are trying to kind of knock the complacency out of people, this might do it. Penultimate slides and then one last one. There was a book published in 1913 at the height of inequality called Around About £1 a Week. And around about £1 a week was what semi-respectable working class people were surviving on in London. More tender reads rate. And it describes how women in particular budgeted to live on around about £1 a week back in 1913. And it was tricky. I put in £1 in 1913 to an inflation calculator to work out what it would be worth today. And the answer, if from memory I've got this right, it's seared on my brain, is I think it was £118 a week, which is what the mother of the poorest child has to spend now. So we've actually gone back to around about £1 a week, not for the very poorest, but the typical child of the worst offset. And things begin to, I think, to break apart at that point. We haven't got worse than that. And it gives me some optimism for these 7 children. But we're a long, long, long way away from this. Notice they have to have a police officer there because the residents of the houses on the posher side who need never have worried. The real irony. What they were worried about is that letting their children go past would reduce the value of their housing in Cuttlerslow. Okay? And you can see why. When my mum and dad moved from Cowley, it would have only cost them £1,000 more to buy in Summertown rather than Risinghurst. So they bought in Risinghurst, which means that my inherited wealth is going to be somewhat less, would have been. But that was the fear. Now, if we do begin to see a reduction in inequality, and I think there's all kinds of reasons to think that we will, there's a sense that things are wrong at the top. The danger is you get what we got in 1934, and we'll get people deliberately building up barriers to get really angry because they're so afraid of what they're going to lose. And what I'll end on, I think I did it. You do well, okay. I'll end on the December 2019 election because I think that is a kind of Cuttlerslow wall building road. When, to put it kind of bluntly, the Guardian newspaper turned on the Labour Party. That's the way I put it. Why did the Guardian newspaper turn on the Labour Party? What were the Labour Party actually proposing? What the Labour Party were proposing at that time was to increase public spending, those graphs I showed you comparing your big countries, to a smidgen below what Germany, the average country in Europe, spends on its public service. Not France, certainly not Scandinavia, but a smidgen below what Germany spends in 5 years, if all went well. What that would have meant, but there aren't many well-paid, there are some well-paid guardian journalists, guardian editors. What that would have meant is tax rises for the top 5%. What tax rises for the top 5% means? There's no more North London Collegiate School for your girl, right? Probably a cheaper private school, but not North London Collegiate. Possibly Camden School for Girls. This is where this, not in Oxford. We could try, I won't do myself at all, I'm translating this to Oxford schools. A skiing holiday goes. Now that may not sound a terrible thing, but if one of your achievements in life is that you're the first generation who's gone skiing, you go skiing every year with your friends, and you work really hard helping produce the Guardian. The idea they're going to take away, and your security begins to go, your ability to save, that trust fund you've set up for the kids, that begins to go. And there's no reward. You're promised that maybe in 20 or 30 years' time, you're going to live in a more equal country, it'll be nicer, right? So what you do, and I don't just going on about the Guardian about it, but this is the kind of the liberal left top 10% of Britain. You know, that Jeremy Corbyn Labour Party, what a mess that is. Terrible. Don't think I can vote for them. That Boris, he's pretty awful, but you know, things will carry on the way they were, won't they? I think it's very similar to building the Cutters Loan. It's not a nice thing to do. I'm sure the people who built it were not particularly proud of what they're doing at the time they did it. But they're just trying to desperately hold on to something that they're worried about losing. Because if you're at the top, it's really scary going. And you don't want to look there, because if you begin to look at such a long way, and you don't feel you're at the top, by the way, if you're senior in the Guardian, because we've got 2,000 to 3,000 bags a year plus in London, and your child is probably one of the poorest at that private school in London. That's the kind of mess we've got to get out of. And that's what our 7 children are going to watch their parents do and argue about. And this happened before, but it will happen differently again. It happened to my grandfather's generation. My grandfather was born in 1916. For his whole life, he watched things largely get better, dramatically better. He had to go to war, so that wasn't great. But in general, he just saw enormous social progress for almost all of his life. My optimistic conclusion for the 7 children is that by being born at a pretty bad time in one of the most unequal places in Europe, unless we do something utterly ridiculous, they'll probably end up telling a story similar to my grandfather, of how you began by worrying about how you got the rent for the landlord every week, and everybody went to the mill at 14 and all that kind of thing. And you end up, or his story at the end of his life was, you end up being asked, what day would you like your operation on the NHS? When you're retired and you've got nothing else to do. And, you know, that kind of success was possible. Thank you for letting me talk to you for so long. And John, I think John's going to ask some questions, and please take any questions.
Thank you very much indeed, first, please. Okay, well, wasn't that powerful, well-researched stuff there from Danny? I've asked him to come back later in the year to sprinkle a bit more magic nuts. He wants to talk about the Bullingham boys and their influence on British politics and how Oxford University influenced them. That, too, will be fascinating. What's coming up? My Jericho question time, which is the 4th My Jericho question time at 6:30, with a panel of a local vicar, a local GP, a local politician, the Jericho Wharf Trust, and maybe the developer. So there's plenty in January. Now, this all costs money, so look down the back of your sofa and see if you can find some extra money to help me kick out this series. It's very easy to contribute. You just go to the bank account Jericho Good Works, Lloyds Bank, 30 96 26. The account number is 48 51 8460. Account number 4851 8460. Salt code 30 96 26. Jericho Good Works. And the event last week raised £135 for the church clock. Now that, as you will have noticed, is working again. But please, we'll find another cause at the church to which you contribute. Meanwhile, we've got to move on to February, and there'll be plenty happening there. So do join us next week for 2 nights and then again in February. Bye now.